Hello guys, this is Joel Sexton here. I'm going to do a two-part video. I call it going with the flow versus studying for oneself. And part one is going to be the cults, the blind leading the blind to hell. And what do I mean by the title of this? Going with the flow versus studying for oneself. What I mean is that with the cults, especially the Jehovah's Witnesses I'm going to talk about, and certain branches of the Adventist Church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, as a member of these churches, these people tend to go with the flow. They don't tend to study for themselves and use proper methods for interpreting the Bible, proper hermeneutics. And they're not taught proper hermeneutics. They're not taught how to exegete, interpret scripture properly. And I was a member of the Adventist Church off and on. I was baptized at the age of 18. I'm 32 now. I became involved. I was expelled from school, actually, my first high school. Then I got expelled from my second. I had a lot of time on my hands, so I started reading some of my dad's material. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, and Doug Batchelor, his prophecy seminar in New York in Net 99, I believe, those videos. And I was convinced this is the truth. This is the first real exposure, being raised Catholic, but first real exposure to the scriptures, to the Bible. So my first exposure, and I was immediately convinced of Adventism, and I went with the flow. Didn't study for myself. It wasn't until I was baptized when I was about 18, 19. When I was 22, I had a great awakening myself. When I started studying the Bible for myself, when I came on Pal Talk for the first time, hence my nickname Joel_in_Christ22, 10 years ago, I'd started studying the Bible for myself. And starting to do that 10 years ago quickly led me out of Adventism, quickly led me out of the Adventist Church. Once I seen that they were wrong when it comes to the Sabbath, Sabbatarianism, their understanding of law, their understanding of a dual law theory, that there's two laws, that the Mosaic law and Torah is different from the Ten Commandments. 1844, the investigative judgment, soul sleep, learning these things were wrong, and their eschatology was wrong. And at the time, I thought their salvation was way off because I started pouring myself into the reformers, what the reformers taught, and what they taught when it came to soteriology, to salvation. And when it came to eschatology, I quickly discovered that the Adventist interpretation of the book of Revelation was wrong, and that the preterist interpretation was actually correct. And I still hold to a preterist interpretation today, to this day. But in this video, I'm going to make a couple points. I'll get my notes up here. The cult's proof text instead of doing exegesis. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to read a definition of proof texting for us. This comes to us from Introduction to Biblical Interpretation, William Klein, Craig Bloomberg, and Hubbard. Bloomberg and Klein. I have other works of theirs. Word publications, and I think these are 3 faculty members of Denver Seminary, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since I read this, but it's an Introduction to Biblical Hermeneutics Interpretation, and this is what they speak when it comes to hermeneutics. Principles of hermeneutics relating to context, page 160, and this is a very popular book when it comes to hermeneutics. If you look on Amazon, this is one of the first books I've ever got. When it comes to studying the Bible, you could see the dust jackets wore out. I went through this, probably half a dozen times, along with a few other books I have on hermeneutics. 3 important principles must guide our practice of interpretation. The first principle is each statement must be understood according to its natural meaning in the literary context in which it occurs. Each statement must be understood according to the natural meaning and literary context which it occurs. This is probably the single most important hermeneutic. Since literary context is at the heart of all language communication, it affects the reader's understanding of both the meaning of the individual words and the meaning of the complete statement, so on and so forth. The second principle is a text without a context may be a pretext. Although an extension of the previous guideline, this principle focuses on a serious, catch this now, in the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Seventh-day Adventists, as well as others, the Mormons, Churches of Christ, some of them are cultic as well, UPC, the cults, what do? Proof text. The second principle, a text without a context may be a pretext. Although an extension of the previous guideline, this principle focuses on a serious abuse, which the cults do, which was I learned very quickly after I started studying on my own. The cults do this. Adventists do this, and we'll give a couple examples of the Adventists using this method and the Jehovah's Witnesses using this method. This principle serves as a warning against the popular tendency to engage in invalid proof texts and quote in biblical passages to prove a doctrine or standard for Christian living without a regard for the literary context. As ridiculous example, one could string along 3 verses to prove, quote unquote, that one ought to commit suicide. Then he, that's Judas, went away and hanged himself. Matthew 27:5. Jesus told him, quote, go and do likewise. Luke 10:37. And what you are about to do, do quickly. John 13:27. The disregard for context is evident. Unfortunately, other proof texting does not appear so ridiculous, but is equally invalid. Such proof texts are mere, quote-unquote, pretexts. When the interpretation fails the principle of literary context, there is nothing wrong with quoting verses to prove a point, provided we understand them according to their contextual meaning. Under the correct circumstances, proof texting can be valid. Before listing any verse in support of a position, we should first check the literary context to ensure the passage is about the same subject and does have the meaning that proves the point. Otherwise, the text is only a pretext, a passage that seems on the surface to prove some belief, but in actuality, it does not. And they go on with other points. And so the Adventists are guilty of this, I learned, when it comes to many of their doctrines, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. First, I'll list the Adventists. When it comes to Sabbatarianism, point number 1, when it comes to the Adventists, they'll go to Exodus chapter 20, 8 through 11, which quotes from Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 and 3. And of course, Exodus chapter 20 does not say Sabbath was given to all creation. It does not say Adam and Eve kept a Sabbath. What would they need to keep a Sabbath for? Their first full day with God was the 7th day. What would they need to rest from before the fall? That doesn't make any sense. They ignore 2 things. First, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 3 says, this covenant, that's the covenant at Horeb, the 10 Commandments, was not given to your fathers, but is given to us, even us, all of us here this day. That is Israel, verse 1 of Deuteronomy 5. It was not given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the fathers. If the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and Torah was not given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how can the Sabbath be given to them? Of course, the Adventists say, well, the 10 Commandments have always been there in the garden, including the 4th commandment. It's glowing in all the pictures of in the Adventist books. The 10 Commandments is just, the 4th commandment is glowing above the rest. And yet, we don't see that at all. We see actually in Romans 9, 1 through 4, Paul says the covenants, the glory, the adoption, and the law, Torah, nomos, is Israel's, national Israel's. That's their right. The law and the covenants. Ephesians chapter 2, the Gentiles were one time afar off, but are brought near to the promises, the commonwealth, that's the city and country of Israel. They've been brought nigh to the city of Israel, the heavenly Zion, the heavenly Canaan, and they've been brought near to the promises, so on and so forth. Israel had the promises, they had the covenants, they had Torah. The Gentiles didn't, and of course the Gentiles were never commanded to keep Torah. And you would think, Paul gives lists of sins, Ephesians 5, Galatians 5, 1 Corinthians 6, sins that'll keep us out of heaven. And not one time does he give breaking Sabbath in those lists. And you would think Gentiles first coming to Christ would need to learn a little bit about Sabbath keeping and kosher laws, but we don't see Paul teaching the Gentile church that at all. And we see also that the Adventists ignore the New Testament interpretation of Genesis chapter 2. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7, through chapter 4, 1 through 11, we see very clearly that Genesis chapter 2 and Hebrews chapter 4 quotes Genesis chapter 2 and says the rest of Eden in the presence of God, before sin, they were in the presence of God. You could say they were in the land in a way, and God was a tabernacle over them, Adam and Eve, before the fall. And that was typical. The antitype is the heavenly land. Joshua did not give them rest. Joshua did not give who rest? National Israel. Rest is land in the Old Testament. Many times the word rest we see, it means the land promise. Joshua did not give them rest. They did not enter into that rest. 600,000 or more perished. Only those 20 and under and Joshua and Caleb entered into the land. So they ignore that. Also 1844. Point number 2 with the Adventists. 1844, the investigative judgment, is based upon Daniel chapter 8:14. Without regard for any context. Daniel 8:14 speaks of Antiochus Epiphanes IV desecrating the earthly temple, not the papacy coming out of Greece somehow and desecrating the heavenly temple. That's not in there at all. 1844 is not in Daniel. It's not there at all. Daniel 8, Daniel 11 speaks of Antiochus Epiphanes. The Tonthal mix, the Egyptians battling with those in Syria. Antiochus Epiphanes. And so the Adventists, again, with the investigative judgment, do the same thing. And their peculiar premillennialism, where the church is in heaven while the earth is desolate for the whole 1,000 years, they do this by tying together Zechariah 14:4 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. That's my third point. They like to tie in text. And the Jehovah's do this as well, I'll demonstrate. Zechariah 14:4 says Jesus will stand on the Mount of Olives when he returns. The Battle of Armageddon, Revelation 16 and 19. And then the Adventists say he touches his feet, then the millennium begins, and 1 Thessalonians 4 says we're caught up to meet him in the air. Zechariah 14 is the second coming, 1 Thessalonians 4 is the second coming, but we're being caught up. The Christians, the Adventists, the remnant of Revelation 12:17, they're the remnant. They read themselves into Bible prophecy, which should tell us there's some major problems there. But they tie these two texts together, and now they have the millennium, 1,000 years in heaven. And of course, Zechariah 14, verse 4, does speak of Jesus returning, his feet touching the Mount of Olives. 1 Thessalonians 4 does say we're being caught up, but what does caught up mean in the Greek? When the Caesar would come to someone's town, it means, the word meet, to meet them in the air, to meet someone. Jesus, the dignitary, comes and meets us, and we take him, the king, the sovereign king, back to where we came from. Caught up to meet him in the air, then we come back down. That is taken from, just like Paul in Thessalonians and Timothy says, Jesus is King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Well, as early as 44 BC, the title King of Kings, Lord of Lords was given to the Caesars. But Paul applies it to the true King of Kings, the true sovereign, the true Caesar, the true Pontius, 1 Timothy 6:16, to Jesus Christ. In the same manner, the Caesars would come to someone's city or town, they would go out and meet him and then taken back. They wouldn't go back to where Caesar came from, where the king came from. They would greet him in the streets and take him back to their city. That's Thessalonians. That destroys the rapture also. You're not caught up into the air for 1,000 years and then come back down. Zechariah 14, that's not how it works. And also, when it comes to higher education in Adventism, it wasn't until 1940, and the Adventist Church was, around 1864, 1856, they had their first 15 doctrinal points. Not until 1940, well after Ellen White died, as passed, did they have their first seminary or Bible college. Ellen White was very much against higher education. I think it's in one of her brown books. You can get those brown books. The Adventists know what I'm talking about, the one on education. I think in there she says higher education, when it comes to seminary, will corrupt the minds to Babylonian beliefs. But of course now the Adventist Church realized after 1940 that seminaries are important. We need to understand the original languages, the Semitic languages of the ancient Near East, in Hebrew and Aramaic and so on and so forth, in Greek, so on and so forth. It's important. It's important in studying the Bible. Context is important. Literary context, the overall context, how to exegete a passage properly, the proper hermeneutics. These things are important. And of course, the cults don't want us to learn these things. If you're studying on your own and learning proper principles of interpretation, studying ancient Near Eastern history, studying history, going through whole books at a time, not just verses, but whole books, whole sections of books, they're not going to like that very much. Now, when it comes to the Jehovah's Witnesses in their proof texting, when it comes to the Watchtower, number one, I'd like to call it the time proof texting method, quote unquote, where two passages of totally different historical and theological backgrounds are slammed together. The 144,000, we're told, are in heaven, while the great multitude is on earth. Sound familiar? Sounds like the Adventist, doesn't it? The reason it is that Psalm chapter, I forget the Psalm, but there's a Psalm there, an early Psalm, that says the remnant would inherit the earth, while John 14 states Christ has many mansions. So the Jehovah's Witnesses reasoning is, well, will the 144,000 go to with Jesus in the many mansions, and this other multitude of Revelation 7 and 14, according to Psalm whatever chapter, I forget what chapter, 11, 12, 13, says certain group will inherit the earth. It's like the dispensational hermeneutic. They do the same thing. Some people are in heaven, some people are on earth. Tying together proof text and method. I see that's bad exegesis. That's a bad hermeneutic. And the Dispies are guilty of it as well as the Adventists and the Watchtower. Therefore, forever, both groups are divided, of course, as shown in another video. I did another video on the Watchtower, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the true identity of the 144,000. I would encourage you to watch that video. You'll be blown away by the true identity of the 144,000. But yeah, they have two groups. One's before Yahweh in heaven, not Jehovah. Not Jehovah. God's name's not Jehovah, it's Yahweh. And then you have their soul sleep doctrine, where they go to the more poetic parts of Scripture, like the Adventists when it comes to soul sleep, the Psalms, Ecclesiastics, Job, instead of going to didactic, teaching portions of Scripture, like 2 Corinthians and Ephesians 2 and Romans, where Paul speaks of our spirit being born again, all of us having a spirit, even the unsaved, if their spirit is unquickened, they are damned. But they'll go to their soul sleep passages where everyone's memory fades away from the earth. Yeah, from the earth. They were in Hades until the cross and the parousia in AD 70. So this is part one of going with the flow versus studying for oneself. Part one. Part two is going to be going with the flow versus studying for oneself. Part two, the fundamentalists and evangelicals. They're guilty of the same things. Thanks for watching, guys.